Serenity Valley Stories introduces The Beast of Blackwood Forest. The fire had burned low, and the embers cast a warm glow across the small clearing. I leaned against Dan, his arm draped around my shoulders as we sat together on a warm blanket. The night was peaceful, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant calls of night birds. The pine trees around us loomed tall, their silhouettes dark against the star-studded sky. "This is perfect," I whispered, nuzzling closer to him. The cool night air made his warmth all the more comforting. "Yeah," he murmured, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "Exactly what we needed." We'd driven up to Blackwood Forest to escape the city for a few days, to disconnect from the chaos and reconnect with each other. The past few months had been stressful, and this trip was supposed to be our little retreat, a weekend of camping, hiking, and simply enjoying each other's company. The scent of pine needles was strong, mixed with the earthy smell of damp soil. It was so quiet here, so peaceful, that it was easy to forget the world existed beyond these trees. The fire had a hypnotic effect, its soft crackles and the occasional pop of burning wood lulling us into a comfortable silence. But then, something rustled in the underbrush. I tensed slightly, lifting my head to listen. Dan must have felt it too because he straightened, his arm tightening around me. The rustling came again, closer this time, followed by a low, almost imperceptible growl. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Dan replied, his voice steady but alert. He grabbed the flashlight, turning it on with a click. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. "Probably just an animal," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. He stood, pulling me up with him. "Let's check it out." I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to stay near the fire, but I didn't want to seem like a coward. We moved slowly, the flashlight leading the way as we walked toward the edge of the clearing. The rustling had stopped, leaving only the faint hum of insects and the occasional rustle of wine through the trees. But the smell hit us before we reached the trees, thick, metallic, and nauseatingly strong. Blood. Dan stopped short, and I nearly bumped into him. "Do you smell that?" he asked, his voice tight. I nodded, covering my nose with my sleeve. It was overpowering, the kind of smell that clung to the back of your throat and refused to let go. My heart began to race, a cold dread settling in my stomach. "Maybe we should just go back to the fire," I suggested, my voice trembling. "Whatever it is, it's not our problem." Dan didn't argue. We turned back toward the fire, but before we could take more than a few steps, a low growl rumbled through the night, louder this time and unmistakably close. "Run!" Dan shouted, grabbing my hand and pulling me along with him. We sprinted back toward the campsite, the sound of heavy footsteps pounding the ground behind us. The fire was in sight, but so was the creature. It burst from the tree line with a ferocity that made my blood run cold. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur that glistened in the firelight. Its eyes were wild, glowing with a feral hunger that sent a primal fear coursing through me. A werewolf, there was no mistaking it. The stench of blood grew stronger as it advanced, its snout dripping with something dark and sticky. Its breath was hot and rancid, filling the air with every low growl it emitted. "Go!" Dan shoved me forward, positioning himself between me and the beast. I didn't want to leave him, but the terror that gripped me was overwhelming, pushing me to run, to escape. I stumbled toward the fire, grabbing a burning branch as I passed. My hands trembled, but I turned back, brandishing the makeshift torch. "Stay back!" I screamed, though my voice cracked with fear. The werewolf hesitated, its eyes flicking to the fire. For a moment, I thought it might retreat, but then it snarled, lunging forward with terrifying speed. Dan threw himself in its path, grabbing a log from the fire and swinging it wildly. The creature reared back, howling as the flames licked its fur. The sound was deafening, a bone-chilling mix of rage and pain that seemed to shake the very ground. "Come on!" Dan shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me away from the campsite, away from the creature. We ran, our footsteps pounding through the forest as the howls echoed behind us. Branches whipped at our faces, the darkness making it nearly impossible to see where we were going. But we didn't stop, didn't dare look back. The beast was still there, we could hear it crashing through the underbrush, its growls growing fainter with distance, but never quite disappearing. We ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they would burst, until the sounds of the creature faded completely. We collapsed near a rocky outcrop, our breaths ragged and our bodies trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, clutching each other, listening to the silence that had returned to the forest. The smell of blood was gone, replaced by the cool, damp scent of moss and earth. "We need to get out of here," Dan finally said, his voice hoarse. "Now." I nodded, too shaken to argue. We didn't bother gathering our things, didn't even glance back at the campsite as we made our way toward the trail that would lead us back to the car. The sun was beginning to rise by the time we reached the trailhead, casting long shadows across the ground. But the fear lingered, a gnawing presence in the back of my mind. We had survived, but the memory of that night would haunt us forever, the night we came face to face with the beast of Blackwood Forest and lived to tell the tale. Thank you for listening to Serenity Valley Stories, and please don't forget to like and subscribe.